Welcome back to our quiet corner. I'm so glad you found your way back here tonight. Here you'll find gentle stories, quietly told, to help you leave the day behind and settle into a peaceful night's sleep. Each evening, I'll share another story with you. All you need to do is make yourself comfortable and listen. Some of you have been visiting for quite some time now, while others may be here for the very first time. However you found your way here, you're always warmly welcome. If you've been enjoying these quiet evenings together, I'd be delighted if you subscribed, so our quiet corner is always easy to find whenever you need it. It means a great deal to share these quiet evenings with you. So, make yourself comfortable and we'll begin. November came softly to Portland, Oregon, laying its gray hand over the city with the patience of rain. The mornings arrived slowly, pale at the edges, gathering themselves from mist and cloud before settling against the apartment windows of Clara Whitfield. Beyond the glass, the street below held the subdued brightness of wet pavements and bare branches. Cars passed with a hush of tires through shallow water, and the coffee shop on the corner gave out a small square of amber light, as if the whole day had been folded carefully and placed inside it. Clara's apartment had the quiet order of someone trained to notice what other people overlooked. On one shelf were linen-covered boxes labeled in her small, even hand. On another stood books on paper, pigment, varnish, textiles, binding, and the slow, exact work of keeping fragile things from vanishing. There were soft brushes in a jar, a magnifying lamp folded neatly over her desk, squares of Japanese tissue in a drawer, and a notebook in which she recorded observations with the same care some people reserved for prayers. Nothing in the room felt severe. It was simply arranged with tenderness and purpose, as though each object had been given enough space to breathe. She was between positions, though she did not think of it as being lost. The museum contract had ended in October. Her next possibility had not yet become definite, and her lease would finish at the end of the year. For the first time in many seasons, her days were not arranged around climate-controlled rooms, accession numbers, and the careful lifting of damaged paper from old backing boards. She rose at the same hour, all the same, made coffee, watered the fern on the sill, and worked through small tasks with a steadiness that made uncertainty feel almost companionable. The envelope arrived on a Thursday morning. It lay on the kitchen table among the usual post, cream, and formal, with a Maine postmark and a solicitor's return address printed in dark blue ink. It looked out of place beside a grocery circular and a reminder from the electricity company. Clara stood with her coffee cooling in one hand and read the name twice. Thomas Alcott, attorney at law, Heron's Point, Maine. There was something about the weight of the envelope, the thickness of the paper that made her set down her cup before opening it. The letter inside was brief, courteous, and astonishing. Her great-uncle, Joseph Whitfield, whom she knew only as a name occasionally mentioned by her late grandmother, had died at the age of 91. His estate, including a former keeper's house on the headland above Heron's Point, had been left entirely to Clara. There was a trust, Thomas Alcott wrote, and a simple condition attached to the inheritance. Before any sale, transfer, or final decision, Clara was to spend 1 month in the house. She read the letter once, then again, her expression hardly changing. Surprise, with Clara, had always moved inward first. She sat at the kitchen table, while rain stippled the window and the radiator clicked faintly under the sill. Great-Uncle Joseph became, for a moment, not a distant branch on a family tree, but a man who had lived somewhere by the Atlantic, growing old beside a lighthouse, thinking of her for reasons she could not yet imagine. After a while, she folded the letter along its original creases, placed it beside her cup, and made more tea. By evening, her practical mind had begun its quiet inventory. She had no contract to break, no garden to leave untended, no one relying on her except a neighbor's basil plant and the fern, which would manage with help. A flight would have been quicker, but speed did not feel suited to the strangeness of what had arrived. Clara decided to drive. 3 days, perhaps 4 if the weather asked for it. Enough time for the thought to settle. Enough miles for the country to open around her and give shape to the question. She packed lightly: wool jumpers, warm socks, a dark coat, a small case of toiletries, the solicitor's letter in a folder, and, almost without thinking, her conservator's notebook. She left the apartment clean, the sheets folded in the linen cupboard, the tools covered, the key with her neighbor, Mrs. Alvarez, who took it with the solemnity of someone accepting stewardship over a small kingdom. Before dawn, Clara carried her bags down to the car. The city was still half asleep, its windows dim and its gutters whispering. And when she turned east, the road ahead seemed to loosen itself from the familiar map of her life. The journey unfolded in long, measured passages. Oregon gave way to the high desert of Idaho, where the land opened wide and pale under a washed sky. Clara stopped for coffee in towns that seemed to rest lightly beside the highway, noting the color of grasses, the shape of grain elevators, the way wind moved over empty lots. In Wyoming, low hills rolled away beneath a cold, blue afternoon, and the clouds arranged themselves in layers like old paper lifted from a portfolio. Her notebook traveled open on the passenger seat, and at rest stops she wrote small observations. rust-red earth at mile marker 312. Two magpies near the pumps. Motel curtains patterned with pine cones. Driving alone across a large country brought its own gentle rhythm. There was roadside coffee, the warmth of paper cups against her palms, the soft thump of luggage shifting in the boot, the evening glow of petrol stations, and the brief companionship of other travelers moving through the same weather. The plains widened, and then slowly gathered themselves into the Midwest, where fields lay dark and harvested beneath low clouds. Further east, the land grew greener again, threaded with rivers and towns older than the road itself. Clara found herself thinking not so much about inheritance as about attention. How every place, like every object, revealed itself slowly if one did not hurry it. By the late afternoon of the third day, the air changed before the town appeared. It sharpened and cooled, carrying salt even through the closed window. The road dipped between dark spruces and weathered houses, and then Heron's Point came into view, as if it had been waiting quietly at the edge of the map. It was smaller than Clara had imagined, a coastal Maine town of narrow streets, clapboard buildings, sloped roofs, and glimpses of the Atlantic at the end of almost every road. Summer, she sensed, had long since departed. The shops were lit, but unshowy. The harbor held a few working boats, and the town had returned to itself with the calm self-sufficiency of places shaped by tide, weather, and long acquaintance. November light lay over everything, low and clear. It silvered the harbor ropes, brightened the edges of slate roofs, and made the sea beyond the breakwater appear both near and immeasurably old. Clara drove slowly, letting the town introduce itself. A post office with a bell over the door, a closed ice cream window, a small library with wreaths not yet hung, a church steeple pale against the sky. At last she found Thomas Alcott's office in a brick building beside a lane that led down towards the water. The office was warm, wood-paneled, and precise. It smelled faintly of old paper, furniture polish, and rain drying from wool. Thomas Alcott rose from behind a desk on which everything had its place. He was elderly, narrow-shouldered, and carefully dressed, with hands that moved unhurriedly, and a voice that seemed accustomed to speaking important things without making them heavy. He greeted Clara as though he had expected her exactly as she was, neither more nor less, and that quiet certainty eased something in her. The paperwork was brief. Thomas explained the estate, the trust, the practicalities of insurance and utilities, and the condition Joseph had set down in plain language. 1 month in the house before any decision. Clara asked sensible questions and listened to the answers with the focus she brought to any unfamiliar material. The house, Thomas said, had once belonged to the keeper of the light. Maine's coast was still watched over by more than 60 old light stations, some active, some quiet now, many kept as heritage sites, private homes, or local trusts after technology and automation had changed the work of guiding ships. Joseph's Tower had been decommissioned decades ago, but it remained standing, as much a part of the headland as the granite beneath it. When everything had been signed, Thomas opened a drawer and placed two things before her. The first was a heavy brass key on a plain ring. The second was a sealed envelope, cream like the letter that had summoned her, with her name written across the front in a careful hand. Clara rested her fingers on it, but did not open it. Thomas did not suggest that she should. He merely said that the heating had been turned on that morning, and that Iris would be expecting company. Clara looked up. "Iris?" "Joseph's cat," Thomas said, with the smallest possible smile. Or perhaps he was hers. It was never entirely clear. He drove ahead in his own car, while Clara followed the road up from the town. The houses thinned. Spruce and bayberry leaned in from either side, their branches dark against the fading sky. The sea appeared in fragments first, flashing between trunks, then opened suddenly below the headland, broad and pewter-colored, moving with a steady breath against the rocks. The lighthouse came into view before the house, a pale stone tower, no longer working, yet still entirely itself. It stood with the composed dignity of something that had done its work well and did not need to announce its retirement. The keeper's house stood beside it, large and white, with green shutters and a roof darkened by weather. The paint was good, the gutters clear, the garden put carefully to bed for winter. Stems had been cut back, beds mulched, pots stacked near the shed. Behind the house, the town lay tucked below its harbor lights. Ahead, the Atlantic stretched into November dusk. Clara stood for a moment in the cold, listening. The sound of the sea was not dramatic. It was simply present, as continuous as breathing. Thomas handed her the key and waited at a courteous distance while she fitted it into the lock. The door opened without resistance. Warmth met her first, then the scents of wood smoke, old books, beeswax, and something faintly herbal drifting from the kitchen. Inside, the ceilings were low, the floors wide-planked and worn to a soft shine. Nothing had been cleared away or arranged for display. The house felt deeply inhabited, not by clutter, but by use. A coat still hanging by the door, walking sticks in a stand, a row of sea charts rolled into a brass bucket. Shelves of books whose spines had faded at different speeds. In the sitting room, a fire burned low and steady. On the armchair nearest the hearth sat Iris, a tortoise-shell cat of considerable age and complete composure. She did not rise. She did not blink more than necessary. Her eyes followed Clara into the room with the calm appraisal of someone who had seen many human arrangements come and go. Clara inclined her head slightly, as though to an elderly curator, and Iris accepted the courtesy without comment. Thomas showed Clara the essentials: the fuse box, the pantry, the linen cupboard, the number to ring if anything required attention. Then, with the tact of a man who understood thresholds, he left her to the house. His car lights slid down the headland road and disappeared among the spruces. Clara remained in the hall until the silence settled around her, though it was not truly silent. The fire shifted. The pipes clicked softly. Somewhere, waves moved against stone. She moved through the rooms slowly, touching almost nothing. The conservator in her could not help reading the house as she would read an object placed on a work table. There were layers here: paint beneath paint on a door frame, a repaired crack in a blue bowl, sun fading on the edge of a curtain, the polished hollow of the banister where a hand had passed for years. In Joseph's study, ledgers stood beside novels and old field guides. In the kitchen, copper pans hung above a scrubbed table, and bunches of dried thyme and rosemary gave the room its faint green fragrance. At last, Clara made tea. The kettle sounded steady and domestic, its steam clouding the dark window above the sink. She found a mug with a small chip near the handle, chose it for no reason except that it felt honest, and carried it back to the sitting room. Iris had shifted from the armchair to the rug, not close enough to be companionable in any obvious way, but near enough to make absence feel less absolute. Clara sat in Joseph's chair, which was worn to the shape of a man she had never met, and took the sealed envelope from her bag. The paper inside was cream, the ink dark, the handwriting careful and slightly slow at the edges of certain words. Joseph addressed her by name, not formally, not distantly, but as if he had been waiting a long time to speak plainly. He wrote that he knew the inheritance would seem strange. He knew, too, that they had never met, and that this absence was his doing more than hers. Families, he said, had their silences, and some silences lasted too long, simply because no one wished to be the first to disturb them. He had known about Clara. He had followed her career in the modest ways available to him. A museum newsletter sent by her grandmother years before, a conservation lecture listed online, a short article in which she had been quoted about the repair of a 19th century atlas. He wrote of her work with respect, not flattery, recognizing the patience it required to look closely at damaged things without trying to make them new. The house, he said, needed that sort of attention. Not repair exactly, and not judgment. Simply someone willing to look, to listen, and to allow old rooms their own pace. Clara read more slowly as the fire settled. Joseph described the lighthouse when it still shone, the keepers before him, the fog bells and lamps, and the long history of coastal watchfulness that had once made such places necessary. He did not romanticize it. The work had been hard, the winters severe, the loneliness real. Yet there was affection in every line. The Maine coast, he wrote, had a way of asking people to become honest with themselves. Not quickly and not unkindly, but with the steady insistence of tide returning to rock. At the end, he asked only that she stay for the month, walk the headland, learn the rooms. Let Iris decide what she thought. Speak with Thomas when necessary, and with the town when she wished. After that, the decision would be hers, wholly and without reproach. If she sold the house, he hoped it would pass to someone who understood its weather. If she kept it, he hoped it would give her not certainty, perhaps, but a place in which certainty was not always required. Clara lowered the letter into her lap. The room had grown darker around the circle of firelight, and beyond the windows, the November night was complete. She could see only a dim reflection of herself, the outline of the chair, the faint glint of Iris's eyes from the rug. Being seen by someone she had never met should have felt impossible, perhaps even intrusive. Instead, it felt like finding a note tucked into the margin of an old book, written long ago by a careful hand, meant for no one else. She thought of her apartment in Portland, orderly and waiting. She thought of the road behind her, the plains, the rivers, the changing light. She thought of the house around her, not asking to be understood at once, and of the town below, small and self-contained beneath the headland. There was no reason to hurry. There was, in fact, every reason not to. Clara folded Joseph's letter with care, returned it to its envelope, and set it on the small table beside the chipped mug. 1 month, she said softly, not quite to Iris, and not quite to the room. Iris closed her eyes, as though this arrangement had always been understood. Outside, the sea continued its quiet work below the cliffs. The lighthouse stood dark but steadfast beside the house, keeping its old shape against the sky. Within, the fire gave a small sigh and settled lower, and Clara sat in Joseph's chair with the first calm certainty she had felt since the letter arrived in Portland. she would stay. For a month, at least, she would let the house reveal itself in its own time, room by room, tide by tide, until whatever waited there had space enough to come gently into view. Morning came to the keeper's house without hurry. It did not announce itself with brightness so much as with a gradual thinning of the dark, a pale loosening at the edges of the curtains, and a soft silvering of the ceiling above Clara's bed. For a few quiet moments she lay still, not yet placing herself, listening to the unfamiliar room gather around her. The sea was there before memory was, moving somewhere below the cliff with its steady, patient sound. It reached the house not as a roar, but as a deep murmur, softened by walls and distance, the sort of sound that seemed less heard than absorbed. When Clara opened the curtains, November stood clear beyond the glass. Frost lay over the headland grass in a fine white nap, bright where the first light touched it, and blue in the hollows. The lighthouse tower rose beside the house, its stone pale and cool, every seam and weathered edge more visible than it had been in dusk. Beyond it, the Atlantic held the color of pewter brushed with pearl, and the far line of the horizon looked freshly drawn. The day had the particular cleanliness of the Maine coast in late autumn, when summer's softness has gone, and winter has not yet fully claimed the air. Downstairs, the house had changed. By lamplight, it had seemed intimate, holding its details close. In morning, it became more exact, more articulate. The runner in the hall showed a faded border of small blue flowers. The banister revealed fine scratches made by rings or keys or the passing of years. Dust motes turned slowly in the slant of light near the sitting-room door. From the kitchen came the faint herbal scent she had noticed the night before. And from the kitchen itself, seated with complete composure beside an empty bowl, came Iris. Clara found a tin of cat food in the pantry without much searching, which suggested either Joseph's orderliness or Iris's previous success in training human beings. While Iris ate with deliberate concentration, Clara explored the cupboards. There was porridge in a glass jar, brown eggs in a bowl, bread wrapped in linen, marmalade in a crock, and a shelf devoted with surprising seriousness to tea. Assam, Darjeeling, smoky lapsang, peppermint, fennel, chamomile. A tin labeled Winter Blend in Joseph's hand, and another marked only Strong Weather. Clara smiled at that, then put the kettle on. The kitchen was the first room she properly inhabited. She learnt its geography by use. The spoons in the drawer to the left of the range, the knives in a block near the chopping board, salt in a blue pot, matches in a tin above the stove, cloths folded beneath the sink. Rosemary, thyme, and a small bay tree stood on the windowsill, their soil dark and recently watered, as if someone from town had kept watch over more than utilities. The pans hanging from the rail were not decorative. Their bases were darkened from years of use, their handles worn smooth where fingers had gripped them. Joseph had cooked properly, Clara thought. Not elaborately, perhaps, but with attention. She made porridge slowly, stirring while the kettle muttered and the windows fogged at the lower corners. Outside, the lighthouse stood clear in the morning light. No longer a mystery, but not yet familiar. The granite ledges below it were ribbed with old tide lines. Gulls moved in the air beyond the glass, holding themselves against a wind Clara could not feel from the warmth of the kitchen. She ate at Joseph's table with her notebook open beside her plate, and wrote her first entry under the date. Pale frost. Sea audible in every room. Iris practical. House orderly without being arranged. Question. What was Joseph preserving? After breakfast, she remade the fire in the sitting room. The wood was stacked in a basket beside the hearth, kindling in an old apple crate, newspapers folded beneath. Clara worked carefully, learning the draw of the chimney, the small habits of flame and draught. Iris watched from Joseph's chair, which she had reclaimed with no sense of negotiation. Clara took the other chair and allowed herself the quiet pleasure of being instructed by a room. The bookshelves stretched along two walls. Maritime history, botany, local histories, poetry, field guides, maps, a shelf of novels with cracked spines, and volumes on weather that seemed to have been opened repeatedly in particular winters. Joseph's handwriting appeared in margins here and there, small, precise, never careless. Beside a paragraph on fog signals, he had written, "Depends on wind." Beside a description of migrating warblers, seen late, 1998, spruce line. Beside a poem, only a question mark, placed so gently it seemed less objection than invitation. On the mantelpiece stood a brass compass, worn smooth at the hinge, a small framed photograph of the lighthouse in snow, and a piece of sea glass the color of pale water. Clara held the glass briefly in her palm. It had once been broken and sharp, and then the sea had taken its time. The sitting room led naturally to the study, as if the books had been preparing her for it. The door stood half open. Inside, the air was warmer and dustier, carrying the particular scent of paper that has lived long in one place. Fiber, ink, cloth, a trace of salt, and the faint sweetness of old glue. Joseph's desk faced not the sea, but the room itself, as though he had preferred to think among shelves rather than views. On its surface lay a green blotter, a pen tray, a magnifying glass, a stack of index cards held by a smooth stone, and an open folder of recent notes, arranged with the quiet order of work still in progress. Clara did not touch the folder at once. Habit and respect held her back. She stood for some time, reading the room from its edges inward. Correspondence files filled one cabinet, each drawer labeled by decade and sender. Ledgers stood along a lower shelf, bound in dark cloth, their spines marked by year. Some began in Joseph's hand. Others were older, the lettering faded, the corners rounded by use. When she drew one gently from the shelf and opened it on the desk, she saw entries dated 1887. Weather, wind, visibility, tide, lamp condition, vessels sighted, repairs made. The handwriting belonged to another keeper, long gone, but its calm duty remained. She was still reading when a knock sounded at the front door, measured and unstartling. Thomas Alcott stood on the step with his hat in his hand and a flat leather case under his arm. He apologized for calling so early, though it was nearly 10, and Clara, already accustomed to the house's slower measure, had lost track of ordinary hours. At the desk, he laid out the formal documents: the house, the contents, the modest trust that would maintain basic repairs for a time, the simple provision that Clara stay for the month before deciding anything final. She asked her questions clearly, and he answered them in the same fashion. Only when the papers were signed did Thomas glance towards the far side of the hall. "There is one room Joseph asked me not to open," he said. "Not until you had settled. He was quite specific, though not theatrical about it." From his pocket, he took a small brass key, far lighter than the one to the front door, and placed it beside Clara's notebook. "When you are ready." He said it without pressure, as if readiness were a practical matter, like waiting for bread to cool or ink to dry. At the door, he paused, looking back into the study with a fondness he made no effort to hide. "He was certain you would understand the house," he said. "I find I am inclined to agree with him." Thomas had barely reached the turn in the road before another knock came, brisker this time, followed by the immediate opening of the door. A woman entered, carrying a fruit cake wrapped in waxed paper and tied with string. She was perhaps in her 70s, broad-coated, bright-eyed, and entirely unapologetic. "You must be Clara," she said. "I'm Delia Marsh, and I'm not staying long." She said this while removing neither her coat nor her scarf, and within 5 minutes she was seated at Joseph's kitchen table with both still on, tea steaming between her hands, and the cake already cut into generous slices. Delia belonged to the kitchen instantly, not by intrusion, but by long acquaintance. She knew which mug had the crack that made it unsuitable for guests, where Joseph kept the cake knife, how much milk Thomas preferred, though Thomas was not there to drink it, and which chair gave the best view of the headland. "The town has been waiting for you," she said, as if this were not alarming but merely seasonal. Clara listened, asked what waiting meant, and Delia gave a small laugh. "Not peering through curtains, if that is what you fear. Only remembering him. Joseph was woven into this place for more than 60 years. When someone like that goes, the town keeps looking towards the house out of habit." She spoke of Joseph without mist or reverence. He had walked the headland every morning, unless the weather made walking impossible, and sometimes even then. He knew which families mended nets in their sheds, whose roof would lose shingles in a northeasterly, where the first blackberries ripened, when seals hauled out on the outer rocks, and which children needed books placed quietly in their path. He served on committees when asked, avoided speeches when possible, repaired the library's atlas cabinet, kept records for the harbor, brought soup without announcing charity, and noticed absences before anyone else had named them. He paid attention, Delia said, and the words settled in the room as neatly as a cup set in its saucer. That was his gift. Weather, birds, boats, people. He could tell you when the herring gulls were nesting late, or when someone in town was trying to manage grief with too much tidying. He kept everything, but not like a miser, more like a witness. Clara thought of the drawers in the study, the ledgers beginning in 1887, the files arranged by year and hand. His life's work, Delia added, then frowned at her own phrase. Though, don't ask me to define it. Joseph never did. After Delia left, having stayed nearly 2 hours, and promised to return only if necessary, which Clara suspected meant soon, the house became quiet again, in a different way. Her stories had altered the air. The study no longer felt like a private accumulation of papers, but like the visible center of a much wider web. Clara returned to the correspondence files and began with the earliest drawer Joseph had labeled in his own hand. She worked slowly, as she had been trained to do, lifting each bundle from its folder, noting paper type, dates, places, repetitions, gaps. There were letters from islands, coves, fishing towns, school teachers, harbor masters, bird watchers, retired keepers, children grown into adults who still sent sightings because Joseph had once told them their observations mattered. The letters carried weather and family together. A woman from farther down the coast wrote of thick fog and a second grandchild. A fisherman noted the date of the first great raft of eiders beyond the harbor mouth. Someone sent measurements of ice in a cove that no longer froze so reliably. There were sketches of feathers, pressed fronds of rockweed wrapped in tissue, lists of birds seen at Christmas, and careful accounts of seals, porpoises, storms, strange tides, late blossoms, early swallows. Before digital messages made everything swift and vanishing, correspondence could hold a life's slow conversation. Here, across decades of envelopes and folded pages, ordinary people had kept speaking to one another through observation. Clara recognized the shape of it before she had words for it. This was not merely local curiosity. It belonged to an older tradition in which amateurs, naturalists, teachers, farmers, sailors, and careful walkers had helped knowledge accumulate by noticing the same things year after year. She thought of the Christmas bird counts that had begun at the turn of the 20th century, when people were asked to count rather than shoot birds during the holiday season, and how more than a century of such patient records had become useful to scientists precisely because many ordinary observers had returned to the same fields, streets, shorelines, and gardens. Joseph had gathered something of that spirit here, not as a program, but as a habit of shared attention. When the afternoon light began to lean, Clara moved from the letters to the Lighthouse records. They formed a separate archive within the study, heavier and more formal. The earliest volumes were keeper's logs, the kind the Federal Service had required from the late 19th century, when the work of tending a light also meant recording its conditions. The entries were spare at first. Wind east by north, sea moderate, lamp trimmed, visibility fair. Then, over years, detail gathered. Repairs to the fog bell, a vessel passing close in thick weather, the arrival of winter oil, ice on the steps, snow against the lantern glass. A rescue noted in one line, its restraint more moving than any elaboration. Joseph's own additions began later, layered with deference over what had come before. He did not overwrite the old keepers. He conversed with them. Beside an 1893 note on thick fog, he had written similar pattern, 1976, longer duration. Near a tide mark from 1911, he had added a comparison from 1998. He noted seabirds nesting on offshore ledges, harbor seals returning to the same rocks, mussel beds exposed after storms, kelp thinning in one cove and thickening in another, lobster boats changing their grounds, mackerel arriving early. Whales reported beyond the islands. The coast emerged not as scenery, but as a living edge, shaped by tide zones, cold currents, seabird colonies, marine mammals, and the great seasonal turnings of the Gulf of Maine. For a long while, Clara sat back from the desk and let the scale of it arrive. A single document might be interesting. A box of letters might be touching. A lifetime of records might be impressive. But this was more than that. It was continuity across more than a century. One stretch of coast observed by many hands, and then gathered by one particularly patient man. The lighthouse itself had changed from human tending to automation, as so many had through the 20th century. Its light no longer requiring a keeper to climb the tower at night. Yet, the keeping had not ended. Joseph had simply shifted the meaning of the work. He had kept watch over change. The first days became a pattern, and then the pattern became a life held gently inside the month. Clara woke to pale light and the sea's continual breathing. She fed Iris, made tea, wrote observations, walked the frost-stiff path along the headland, and returned to the study. Delia came and went with soups, bread, gossip, corrections, and names Clara had not known she needed. Thomas rang only when necessary. The town below altered gradually from a view to a set of recognizable lights, roofs, errands, and faces. 3 weeks passed in this way, not quickly, but with the quiet firmness of tide filling a harbor 1 inch at a time. On an evening near the end of the 3rd week, Clara sat in the study, with the lamp turned low, and the house settled around her. The fire had burned down in the sitting room. Iris slept somewhere beyond sight. Outside, the sea moved unseen below the cliff, and the lighthouse stood dark against a sky without moon. The small brass key lay where Thomas had left it, beside her notebook, its surface dulled by age and warmed slightly by the pool of lamplight. Clara picked it up for the first time and closed her fingers around it. She knew the door by then, though she had not opened it. It stood at the end of the short corridor beyond the study, plain, painted white, unremarkable except for the faint wearing of the carpet before it, as if Joseph had stood there often, pausing, or entering, or simply remembering. The corridor was quieter than the rest of the house. Even the sea seemed softened there. Clara walked to the door and stopped with the key in her hand. There was no fear in the moment, and no hurry, only readiness, gathered slowly through mornings, letters, ledgers, tea at the kitchen table, Delia's stories, and Joseph's careful pages. The brass key rested warm against her palm, The lock waited before her, and the house held itself in a stillness so complete that turning the key seemed less like breaking a silence than answering one that had been waiting patiently for years. Clara turned the key as gently as if the lock itself were an old document. There was a small inward give, a click softened by age, and then the door moved away from her. At first, the room did not resolve into anything definite. The lamplight from the corridor reached only a little way across the threshold, touching the edge of a table, the side of a shelf, the pale square of a window. What came first was the smell. Paper, ink, cloth, dust held in check, and the dry, steady warmth of a room kept closed but not neglected. It was the smell of an archive waiting in perfect order. She stood where she was and let her eyes adjust. Shelving filled every wall from floor to ceiling, not crowded, but exact. Each run arranged with a care that made the room feel larger than its dimensions. Bound journals stood in dark rows, their spines marked in gold. Archival boxes, plain and pale, occupied the lower shelves. Flat map drawers lined one side beneath a narrow north-facing window, through which the last of the evening gave a clean blue light. At the center of the room stood a large, dark table, and on it, spread with the composure of work interrupted only briefly, lay maps, photographs, correspondence, and charts. Iris appeared beside Clara without sound. The old cat sat just beyond the threshold, tail curled neatly around her paws, and looked into the room with an attention so still it seemed almost formal. Clara had the odd impression that Iris was not entering because she had already known the contents, and was allowing Clara the courtesy of discovery. For another long moment, neither of them moved. The house held itself behind them. The sea, usually present at every edge of hearing, seemed unable to reach this inner room. When Clara stepped inside, the conservator in her rose completely to the surface. She did not touch the first thing nearest her. She took in the temperature, the dryness, the way the shelves had been placed away from the outer wall, the blinds fitted to protect the table from direct light, the absence of damp, the quiet hum of a dehumidifier in one corner. Joseph had not merely stored papers here. He had cared for them. He had understood, perhaps without training, and perhaps through long practice, that preservation was an act of patience, repeated again and again, until it became a form of love. She moved along the first wall, reading labels without yet opening anything. Headland weather, tidal notes, migratory birds, intertidal plants, harbor ice, storm damage, family histories. oral accounts, vessel sightings. Names appeared too: Marsh, Bellamy, Cho, Nadeau, Price, Levesque, Ortiz, Cushing. Names from along the coast, some written on boxes, some on folder tabs, some on the spines of copied journals. The order was both practical and deeply personal. It followed chronology where chronology mattered, geography where place mattered, and relationship where the person mattered more than either. The table drew her slowly to the center. A magnifying glass rested on the edge of a recent map, its handle angled towards the chair, as though Joseph had put it down only to turn a page. Beside it stood a mug, long empty, with a faint ring of tea at the bottom. The pages nearest the chair were covered in Joseph's handwriting, the same careful hand she knew from his letter, though here the lines slowed slightly at their ends. The work gathered lighthouse logs, tide charts, photographs, and letters into one continuous record of the headland and its neighboring coves. Clara saw dates running from the late 19th century to the present, observations linked by place, weather, season, and witness. On the most recent page, Joseph had been writing a sentence about the return of harbor seals to the outer ledges after a run of milder winters. The ink was dark, the words steady, and then the line stopped mid-thought. Clara did not dramatize what she saw. She had worked among enough traces of absent hands to know that endings often arrived without ceremony. Still, the closeness of him came into the room with a tenderness that made her sit down. The chair gave beneath her exactly as if it had expected another keeper of careful things. After a while, she rose and began again, more systematically. The journals occupied an entire wall. There were hundreds of them, 6 decades of Joseph's daily and weekly observations, some written in neat notebooks, others in bound volumes he had clearly ordered for the purpose. The photographs filled cabinets, black and white prints of the tower in fog, children on the harbor wall in the 1950s, fishermen mending gear, winter ice, summer kelp, storm-worn steps, gull colonies on offshore rocks. Later, color photographs of the same places under changing light. Every print was labeled in his hand with date, place, direction, and often the smallest addition: moon low, first frost, Delia's nephew, Eider's late. The maps were rolled and flat, official and hand-drawn, some showing shoals and channels, some the contours of the headland, some the shifting boundaries of salt marsh and beach. Clara unrolled one only as far as it wished to go, feeling under her fingers the dry grain of old paper and the faint resistance of linen backing. The correspondence here was different from the study files. This was not Joseph's ordinary exchange, but the archive's own collection, contributor by contributor, decade by decade. She understood then that the study had been the working mind of the house. This room was its memory. A distant knock reached her as a soft interruption from another world. Clara closed the map, set the weight back carefully, and went to the front door. Delia Marsh stood outside, with no cake this time, only her wool hat pulled low, and her expression unusually quiet. She looked past Clara towards the corridor, and Clara understood that she had not come by chance. In the archive doorway, Delia stopped. Something loosened in her face. Not surprise exactly, but relief. "Good," she said, and her voice was softer than Clara had yet heard it. "He wanted you to see it for yourself first." Delia stepped inside as though entering a chapel she had helped dust. She touched the nearest shelf with 2 fingers, familiar and fond. "I knew about it," she said. "Of course I did. Half the coast did, in one way or another, though most people knew only their own part." She gave Clara a glance that was almost apologetic. "I sent him weather notes every month for 40 years. Frost dates, fog days, birds in the marsh, which families moved away and which came back. Who remembered what their grandparents had said about the great storms? Joseph said memory was only useful if someone wrote it down before it turned into mist. They stood together among the shelves while Delia described the network. It had begun with a few retired keepers and fishermen, men and women who already watched the weather because their work required it. Then a schoolteacher from one of the islands had begun sending bird lists from 3 nesting colonies. A harbor master noted sea ice and spring launch dates. A lobsterman recorded surface temperatures each morning at the same mooring for 30 years. First because Joseph asked politely, and then because the habit became part of his day. Children sent drawings of unusual shells. Gardeners sent first flowering dates. Families sent stories. Widows sent boxes. Joseph sorted, answered, copied, compared, and connected them all. He made people feel that noticing counted, Delia said. Not in a grand way. He never made anyone feel grand. But he made the small act seem worth doing properly. Clara listened, feeling the weight of the room alter as each unseen contributor entered it. The archive was not merely Joseph's achievement. It was a coastline, speaking in many hands over time. It belonged to people who had looked out of kitchen windows, hauled traps, crossed schoolyards, repaired boats, waded through fog, counted birds at Christmas, measured snow against fence posts, and written down what they saw because someone steady had asked them to. Delia's stories carried the wider history without ever naming it as such. Clara thought of older American observers, of long-kept weather diaries at Monticello and elsewhere, where daily temperatures, rain, birds, leaves, frost, and flowering had been noted with the belief that the pattern of ordinary days mattered. She thought again of the Christmas bird count, begun in 1900 as a gentler answer to holiday shooting parties, and now one of the longest continuous community science efforts in the world. Such records became powerful not because one entry was remarkable, but because thousands of modest entries, repeated over years, gave change a shape. Joseph had known that. So had everyone who had written to him, whether or not they would have used the language of science. Clara saw with a clarity that made her very still what she had inherited. Not a house alone, not even an archive alone, but a responsibility held together by trust. The lighthouse keeper's logs that began when the Federal Service required such daily records had become, through Joseph, something broader and more intimate. A continuing record of weather, wildlife, work, memory, and place. On a coast as richly layered as Maine's, where tide pools, spruce headlands, seabird ledges, eelgrass beds, seals, porpoises, and winter storms all belonged to the same living edge. Such continuity was not quaint. It was evidence. It was history. It was a form of care. Delia did not stay long by Delia's standards, which meant she stayed until the tea went cold. When she left, the archive felt neither emptier nor quieter. It felt more inhabited. Clara returned to the shelves she had not yet reached, the furthest wall, where bound volumes gave way to boxes. These were labeled not by subject, but by name and date. Contributor collections, she realized, sent to Joseph for safekeeping. Bellamy, Ruth, 1962 to 1981. Cho family, Cranberry Island, 1974 to 1999. Marsh, Delia, Weather and Recollections, 1980 to 2020. Whitfield, Eleanor, 1989 to 2019. Clara stopped completely. The name seemed at first to have appeared by some trick of expectation, the way a familiar word may surface in unrelated print when the mind is tired. But it remained. Eleanor Whitfield. Her mother's name. The label was written not in Joseph's hand, but in another she recognized before she consciously understood it. The leftward lean of the capital E. The slight pressure at the end of the final D. The careful spacing. Her mother's handwriting. Seen on old recipe cards, birthday envelopes, notes tucked into lunch boxes years ago. Clara lifted the box down with both hands. It was not heavy, but she carried it as if weight were only one form significance could take. She set it on the central table and sat before opening it. Iris, who had appeared again without announcement, jumped lightly onto the table and arranged herself at a respectful distance from the box. Clara loosened the cotton tape. Inside were letters, bundled by year, a small journal with a blue cover, and photographs placed face down on top. She turned the first photograph over. There she was, at perhaps 4 years old, standing on a pavement after rain, in a yellow coat, holding a leaf nearly as large as her face. Another showed her at 8, serious beside a school display. Another at 12, hair blown across her eyes, laughing at something outside the frame. The photographs were not casual duplicates. They had been chosen, sent, received, kept. Clara placed them in a careful row and opened the earliest bundle of letters. Her mother's handwriting filled the first page, younger and looser than Clara remembered it, written from a town in Vermont where Clara had been a baby. "Dear Joseph," it began, and the simplicity of those 2 words opened a passage through 30 hidden years. Eleanor had written from every place the family lived: Vermont, Ohio, Oregon, small rented houses, apartments near schools, a year of difficulty, seasons of ordinary busyness. Joseph had answered from Heron's Point. His letters were folded among hers, warm, specific, never demanding. As Clara read, the distance in the family changed shape. It had not been indifference. It had been an old fracture, made before Clara was born. A disagreement between siblings, hardened by pride, then preserved by illness, geography, and the human tendency to mistake silence for peace. Eleanor had kept writing to Joseph after others stopped speaking his name aloud. She had sent photographs, school programs, small accounts of Clara's seriousness, Clara's collections of pebbles, Clara's habit of mending torn picture books with tape and great concentration. Joseph had written back with patience, asking after them, describing the coast, enclosing pressed leaves, postcards of the Lighthouse. Once a careful drawing of one of the Lighthouse cats as a kitten, all angles and opinion. The letters were not dramatic. That was what made them so deeply moving. They carried recipes, weather, griefs touched lightly, repairs to roofs, new jobs, Clara's school reports, Joseph's aching hands, Eleanor's hope that one day things might soften. A sustained correspondence, Clara knew professionally, could become one of the most revealing forms of historical record. It showed not only events, but attention. What 2 people chose to tell one another, what they repeated, what they omitted, what they trusted to paper because paper could wait without interrupting. Here, by lamplight, those 30 years lay across the table in two familiar hands. She read until the house was entirely still. In this interior room, the sea no longer reached her. Or perhaps she had gone so far inward that even the sea had given her privacy. The archive lamp made a pool of warm, steady light. Iris lay with her paws tucked beneath her, blinking slowly whenever Clara turned a page. Near the end, Joseph's letters had grown slower, but no less exact. He wrote that Clara's work seemed to him a kind of kinship, though he would not presume upon it. He wrote that he had made provision for the house, not because blood alone deserved inheritance, but because attention did. He wrote that Eleanor had believed Clara would understand what to do when the time came. Clara set the last letter down beside the others and rested her hands in her lap. The feeling that settled over her was not grief, though grief was present somewhere within it. It was larger and gentler than that, made of astonishment, tenderness, regret, gratitude, and an odd peace at having arrived late, but not too late. Around her, the shelves held weather and tide, birds and boats, storms and births, kitchen window observations and official logs. The many forms by which human beings had tried to say, "This mattered. I saw it. I was here." The decision that had been gathering since the first morning did not announce itself. It did not arrive as a vow or a plan or anything that needed to be spoken into the quiet. It was simply there, warm and certain, as if it had been part of the room all along, waiting for Clara to sit still enough to recognize it. She looked at her mother's handwriting, at Joseph's unfinished sentence, at Iris sleeping beside the letters, and felt the house come gently into her keeping. By the next morning, Clara woke to a house that felt neither new nor altered, but more fully known. The pale December light had come into the bedroom quietly, resting on the floorboards and the folded jumper at the foot of the chair. For a moment, she lay still and remembered. Not all at once, but gently. The open archive door, the letters on the table, her mother's handwriting beside Joseph's, the decision that had settled in her without sound. Downstairs, the archive lamp was still burning, its warm square of light visible from the corridor, like a small hearth at the center of the house. In the kitchen, Clara moved without searching. She filled the kettle, chose tea from the winter blend tin, opened Iris's food, set a pan on the range, and only afterwards noticed that she had done each thing as if she had always known where everything belonged. Iris sat on the windowsill, rather than beside her bowl, watching frost brighten the headland grass. The lighthouse stood pale and still beyond the glass, and the herbs on the sill gave off their faint green fragrance when Clara brushed them with her sleeve. Wood smoke, old paper, rosemary, tea, and cold light. The morning held all of it together with a steadiness that felt like welcome. After breakfast, she went not to the archive table, but to Joseph's study desk. It seemed right that practical matters should be handled there, in the room where he had arranged papers, answered letters, and kept the outer workings of the house in order. She took a sheet of cream writing paper from his drawer and uncapped her own pen, the one constant she had brought from Portland and carried across the country in her coat pocket. The letter to Thomas Alcott was brief. She thanked him for his care, confirmed that she intended to remain in the keeper's house beyond the required month, and wrote that Joseph's condition had already begun to do what he had hoped it would do. When the month was complete, she would ask Thomas to prepare whatever papers were needed to make that decision formal. Then she signed her name, sealed the envelope, addressed it, and set it beside the lamp. The decision, once inward and wordless, now existed in ink, certain in spirit and patient in practice. From there, the next task opened naturally. Clara carried her notebook into the archive and drew out the correspondence files Joseph had maintained so carefully. The addresses were current enough to begin with, amended in pencil when people moved, cross-referenced when sons had taken over from fathers or pupils from teachers. She did not write a form letter. Joseph would not have done so, and the archive itself seemed to require more courtesy than that. To Delia she wrote first, though Delia already knew, because some things were worth putting down. To Ruth Bellamy's daughter, she mentioned the Marsh notes from 1978. To the school teacher on the island, she referred to the turn lists and the little drawings in the margins. To the elderly fisherman, whose temperature readings ran in an unbroken line for 3 decades, she wrote that his record remained one of the archive's quiet treasures. Each letter took time, and Clara gave it time. The work was not so different from conservation, though the material was human trust rather than paper or cloth. She chose her words with care, not ornamenting them, not making promises too large for one person to keep. Joseph's archive was safe. The work was continuing. Their observations still mattered. If they wished to send more, she would receive them. If they wished to visit, the house would be open. By the end of the afternoon, the table held a quiet constellation of sealed envelopes, and Clara's own notebook had begun to fill with names, questions, and small reminders. Ask Delia about Marsh tide gauge. Check Bellamy photographs. Order acid-free folders. Write to Thomas about legal structure. The replies began to arrive within days. Some came in handwriting, the envelopes pleasingly uneven, the addresses written by people who had held pens all their lives. Some came by email, printed out because Clara wanted to keep the chain visible. One morning, the telephone rang, and a man with a voice weathered by 50 years of knowing Joseph said he was glad she had come, and then, after a pause, gave her the sea temperature at his mooring out of habit. Clara wrote it down at once. Other replies held relief, gratitude, and a kind of shy excitement. People had wondered whether the archive would disappear into storage or sale, whether Joseph's careful asking had ended with him. Clara answered each one in turn, sitting at Joseph's desk with her notebook open beside her, feeling the old network stir awake like a banked fire taking air. The days found their pattern. Mornings belonged to the desk. Letters, cataloging, lists, the gentle labor of understanding what had been placed in her care. Afternoons belonged to the headland. Clara walked the worn path from the kitchen door towards the lighthouse, the grass winter pale on either side, the ground firm beneath the frost. Her own observations began to enter the record, first tentatively, and then with steadier confidence. Her handwriting, narrower than Joseph's and a little more angular, appeared beside his in the new notebook she had opened for the season. Iris organized the household around this work with complete authority. Breakfast at the correct time. Fire watched from the correct chair. Afternoon sleep in the narrow square of sun on the upstairs landing. Evening supervision from the kitchen windowsill. The house became Clara's not by possession, but by use. She did not replace Joseph. Nothing asked that of her. His mug remained in the cupboard, his annotations in the books, his unfinished sentence on the archive table. But her coat hung by the door now. Her pen lay on the desk. Her boots dried near the range, and her pages entered the record after his. Continuation, she discovered, was not imitation. It was attention carried forward in another hand. Delia came most mornings, sometimes with something useful, and sometimes with herself, which was often more useful. She brought names, stories, corrections, jars of soup, news from the harbor, and firm opinions about how long one could safely ignore a loose shutter. Through Delia, Heron's Point opened to Clara properly. The postmaster remembered Joseph's parcels of field guides. The librarian had once argued with him for 3 winters about the arrangement of local histories, and still spoke of him with affection. The baker knew Iris by reputation. People were cautious at first, then curious, then kind in the unobtrusive way of towns with long memories. Clara did not try to charm them. She listened, remembered, and returned greetings by name. In time, that was enough. On a clear afternoon in December, after Delia had gone back down the road with an empty soup jar and 3 new instructions, Clara took the path to the lighthouse. The day was very still, the kind of stillness that did not mean the air had stopped moving, only that every movement had become visible. The thin trembling of dried grass heads, the low flight of a gull, the faint lift of steam from Clara's breath as she climbed. The lighthouse waited at the top of the headland, stone and solid and entirely itself in the winter light. It had no beam to cast, no keeper required by regulation, no lamp to tend through the night, and yet it remained a point of orientation for everyone below. From the base of the tower, Heron's Point lay below her, in a fold of land and harbor, its roofs dark, its windows small and bright where the low sun struck them. The Atlantic stretched beyond the ledges in deep, cold blue-gray, clear to the horizon, so immense and unhurried that looking at it seemed to lengthen the breath. Winter light on the Maine coast had a way of simplifying the world without making it bare. It sharpened the line of the breakwater, polished the wet rocks, turned the spruce trees almost black, and laid a narrow path of silver over the water where the tide moved in. Clara opened her notebook, holding the pages flat with one gloved hand while she wrote with the other. On the rocks below, where kelp lay dark and glossy after the tide, a harbor seal rested with its head raised towards the light. It was so still at first that she might have mistaken it for part of the rock. But then it shifted, lifted one flipper slightly, and settled again. She noted the time, the tide, the weather, the position of the seal, the wind direction, the quality of visibility. Harbor seals were among the familiar presences of this coast, hauling out on ledges and quiet rocks to rest between their journeys through the cold water. But this one, at this moment, was not an example of anything. It was simply present, entirely at home in its own element, and Clara wrote it down. As her pen moved, understanding arrived without effort. This was what Joseph had done, and what Delia had done, and what the fisherman with the morning temperature had done, and what careful people had always done when they loved a place enough to notice it faithfully. Long records mattered, because change often entered quietly. A bird nested late. A cove froze less often. A seal returned to one rock instead of another. Sea temperatures shifted by fractions until, over years, The fractions formed a pattern, visible to anyone willing to look slowly. The Gulf of Maine was changing, as all living places changed, and records held over time could help the future understand what had been given, altered, lost, and kept. Clara stood there until the cold had entered her cheeks and the sun lowered another inch. There was no sudden revelation, no need for one. Only the lighthouse at her back, the town below, the seal on the rocks, the notebook in her hand, and the complete, uncomplicated sense of belonging to the work before her. When she returned to the study, she copied the entry neatly into the new section of the record. Her notes were precise, but they carried her own voice. Frost lifting by noon. One harbor seal on outer ledge, head raised, untroubled. 3 eiders beyond the kelp line. Delia says bayberry holds its leaves longer in sheltered years. Ask about old path to South Cove. Joseph had seen much, but not everything. No one could. That was why the work needed more than one life. It was Delia who decided there should be a gathering. She arrived one morning with a list already written, a firm date chosen, and the air of someone who was not asking permission so much as giving Clara the pleasure of agreeing. The sitting room was rearranged over the next 2 days. Chairs came from bedrooms and the study. The firewood basket was filled twice over. Clara made soup, bread, tea, and more cake than seemed possible for one house to require. Delia brought chowder, pickles, biscuits, and a level of organizational authority that even Iris respected from a distance. The archive door was left open. For the first time since Clara had arrived, the room waited not in secrecy, but in welcome. They came from along the coast in the late afternoon. Older people who had known Joseph for decades. Middle-aged sons and daughters carrying folders for parents who no longer drove. A younger woman from an island school with a packet of bird lists. A retired harbor master. 2 sisters with their grandmother's weather diaries. And the fisherman whose voice Clara recognized before he introduced himself. The house filled gradually, not noisily, but warmly. Coats hung along the hall. Boots stood in a row near the door. The sitting room smelled of wood smoke, food, wool drying, and the particular comfort of a full room in winter. Conversations opened everywhere. In the kitchen, someone compared this December's tides with a winter in the 1970s. Near the fire, Delia corrected a family story with affectionate precision. In the archive, contributors moved along the shelves with expressions Clara recognized: surprise, pride, shyness, remembrance. One woman found her father's notebooks and touched the box as if greeting him by hand. The island teacher stood before the bird records and spoke softly about how children learnt to observe differently when they knew their lists would become part of something larger. The retired harbor master described how old lighthouse logs had once been practical tools of navigation and maintenance, and how, in time, such steady coastal records had become evidence for questions no keeper in 1887 could have imagined. Clara moved through it all with a calm she would not once have expected of herself. She welcomed people, listened to their accounts, asked where records had been kept, remembered who preferred tea without milk, and watched the archive become not less precious because it was shared, but more alive. This was how knowledge had always traveled in small coastal communities, through meetings at kitchen tables, winter gatherings, harbor talk, letters, shared meals, repeated stories, and the trust that someone would remember accurately enough for the next person to build upon it. Joseph's world had not returned exactly as it was. It had taken a breath and continued. When the last contributor had gone, and the final car lights dropped down the headland road, Clara and Delia cleared up together without talking much. Plates were stacked, mugs washed, chairs returned, crumbs brushed from the table, soup cooled for tomorrow. Iris, who had received the gathering from Joseph's chair with impeccable composure, stretched and disappeared towards the stairs. At the door, Delia wound her scarf around her neck and looked once into the hall, where the archive light still reached the floor. "He would have liked that," she said. Then, before Clara could answer, she added, "Not too much fuss, mind," and went out into the cold with a brief wave. The house settled slowly. Its rooms released the warmth of voices by degrees, the way a hearth releases heat after the flames have lowered. Clara went to the archive and sat at the central table. Joseph's final folder lay where she had placed it, the last page of his handwriting ending mid-sentence, the blank sheets beyond waiting with patient openness. She turned to the first of them. For a while, she sat with the pen uncapped and said nothing. Then she began a letter to Joseph. She wrote without sentimentality, because sentimentality would have made the truth smaller. She told him she had found the room and the work and Eleanor's letters. She told him that Delia had explained enough and left enough for Clara to discover herself. She told him the network was awake again, that the fisherman had rung with the morning temperature before offering his condolences, that the island teacher had brought new bird lists, that the house had held everyone easily. She wrote that she understood, not completely, because complete understanding was rarely granted, but enough to begin. She intended to stay. She intended to preserve the archive, to continue the record, to make sure the work belonged both to the coast that had made it and to the future that might need it. Her handwriting looked different from his on the page, and yet it sat beside it naturally. When she finished, Clara let the ink dry. Then she gathered the pages back into the folder. The sound of the paper settling was soft and final, though not an ending. She set down the pen, switched off the archive lamp, and stood for a moment in the doorway, with the darkness of the room behind her and the warmer darkness of the house ahead. The archive no longer felt hidden. It felt rested. Outside, the December evening was cold and clear. Stars had begun to show above the lighthouse, sharp as pinpricks in the deepening blue. The town below lay gathered around its harbor, windows lit one by one, each square of light holding a kitchen, a table, a hand lifting a cup. A life continuing in its ordinary, necessary way. Beyond the breakwater, the Atlantic was dark and enormous, moving with a patience older than the town, older than the lighthouse, older than any record kept of it. Behind Clara, the keeper's house glowed softly. The archive window gave out a last warm reflection before the lamp's heat faded from the glass. On the kitchen windowsill, Iris sat upright and composed, watching Clara through the pane as though supervising the final entry of the day. Clara opened her notebook to a fresh page. The wind lifted the corner gently, and she held it flat with one hand, while the other found the pen. She wrote the date. She wrote the time. She wrote clear sky, frost returning, town lights visible, sea steady below the headland. Then she paused and looked out across the water, letting the quiet widen around her. The lighthouse stood beside her, no longer shining, and yet still keeping its place. The house waited behind her, warm with paper, wood smoke, herbs, memory, and sleep. The town rested below in its small bowl of harbor light. The Atlantic breathed in the dark. Clara's pen moved once more, slowly and steadily, adding a single line to the long record of the coast. And in the soft space after it, with Iris watching from the window, and the stars brightening over Heron's Point, the work continued.